The dust didn't settle. It danced, thick and red like rusted velvet, rising off the earth in lazy spirals as the train hissed to a halt under the searing Texas sun. The doors clanked open with a metallic groan, and then silence. Inside the boxcar, 33 German women stood shoulder to shoulder, boots scuffed, hands trembling, eyes narrowed against the light. They had been told to expect chains, told to prepare for humiliation, told that Americans treated prisoners like animals. But what they saw made no sense. Two cowboys stood by a wooden corral, not with rifles, but with reins. Horses, saddled, brushed, breathing calmly under the sun. A young man in denim held out a canteen, smiling shyly, as if greeting guests, and a voice, slow, southern, said gently, "You ladies ready for the ride?" One woman, Frida, 21, a former typist from Cologne, didn't move. She stared at the animals, then at the open field. Beyond, no barbed wire, no dogs, just open sky and that impossible scent of cedar and cotton. Her fingers clenched tighter around the handle of her suitcase. It wasn't fear. It was confusion. Nothing in Nazi propaganda had prepared her for this. Behind her, someone whispered, "This is a trick." Another muttered, "Stay alert." But Frida stepped forward anyway, her boots crunching on gravel. She reached out. The horse didn't flinch. And in that moment, somewhere between disbelief and wonder, she realized something had already begun to break inside her. Not her body. Her certainty. She mounted the saddle. No orders barked. No guns raised. Just wind, sun, and the creak of old leather. What none of them knew yet was that this was just the beginning, and the real shock wouldn't come from what the Americans did, but from what they refused to do. Frida had always believed in German engineering. Back home, her brother had worked on U-boats, polished machines of cold precision, and months of labor. He used to say, "We build slowly because we build to last." But now, as she stood on the dusty porch of the barracks, staring at a photo one of the guards had handed her, that belief cracked. It was a picture of the ship she had crossed the Atlantic on. Liberty ship, number 723, mass-produced in a shipyard in Oregon. A man in uniform, smiling, proud, had scrawled something on the back. Built in 4 days flat. 4 days. Frida's lips parted, but no sound came out. She turned the photo over again, eyes scanning for a lie, a flaw, anything to make it untrue. 4 days to construct a steel behemoth with an engine, living quarters, armaments, radar. Impossible. She took it to Helga, an older woman who had worked in logistics for the Wehrmacht. Helga read the note 3 times, then shook her head slowly, eyes distant. "Even at our best," she whispered, "we needed at least 6 months, and that was with forced labor." Frida looked out across the prairie. Somewhere, just beyond the fields, were American factories still churning, around the clock, untouched by bombs, fed by coal, not fear. She remembered the creaks of that ship, the strange smoothness of its passage, the humming of electric light in the hallway, the scent of soap, the warmth of metal that wasn't rusted or patched with desperation. It wasn't just the speed, it was the confidence. As if they could outbuild the war. That night, someone asked the guard if it was true. He shrugged and smiled. "Actually, our record's 3 days and 10 hours. Frida didn't sleep, not because she was afraid, but because she had just seen something her country said was impossible and realized it was only part of what lay ahead. They didn't even notice the windows at first. The women were being transported through Dallas, en route to another holding site, when one of them, Lotta, leaned her head against the glass of the Pullman car and frowned. "It's night," she said. "But the factories, they're still working?" Frida turned to look. Out past the prairie, across a line of darkened homes, stood a block-long industrial complex, windows aglow, smoke curling steady from the stacks, and under the buzz of street lamps, trucks moved in and out without pause, like veins feeding a body that refused to sleep. Back in Germany, blackout drills were life. The sound of a child coughing too close to the curtains could trigger panic. Factories were dark, silent, wounded, electricity rationed. Bombs fell like clockwork. But here it was, as if the war didn't exist. Their American escort, a woman in uniform with soft eyes and a sharp voice, noticed them staring. "That's one of 3 plants in the area," she said. "Shifts run 24/7. Been that way since 42. "Don't you fear the Luftwaffe?" someone asked, half mocking. She laughed. "Luft what?" The other women chuckled, but Frida didn't. Something twisted inside her. This wasn't just about power, it was about confidence. A nation so unshaken, it left its lights on while the world burned. That night, they arrived at a barracks with electric fans, lit hallways and warm water. A guard flipped a switch, and the dormitory filled with soft, steady light. Frida didn't speak. She just stared at the ceiling. At home, even candles were luxuries. Here, the bulbs never blinked. She whispered to no one, "Maybe this war isn't being fought the way we thought." But that was just the beginning. The next morning, breakfast came with Coca-Cola and confusion. They thought the Americans were mocking them. It was the 3rd day at sea, somewhere in the Atlantic, when the guards began handing out glass bottles, brown, sweating from the cold, with red and white labels printed in cursive English. Frida turned hers in her hand like it was a trick. Coca-Cola. Beside her, Ilse opened hers, sniffed it, and laughed dryly. "Maybe it's poisoned." But then, one of the sailors, barely more than a boy, popped his own cap off with his belt buckle and took a long swig. "Goes well with the sun," he smiled. Frida hesitated. The bottle was cold. Too cold. She hadn't held anything that cold in years. Then it got stranger. That night, after roll call, a guard wheeled in a metal cart, and from it came clouds of dry ice and the unmistakable scent of vanilla. Ice cream. Scooped into paper cups, handed to prisoners of war. It wasn't the sweetness that stunned them. It was the fact that someone thought they deserved it. Frida sat on the deck, her back against the railing, licking slowly as the waves rolled by. A girl from Munich began to cry, silent tears sliding down her face, mixing with the cream on her chin. Back home, food was rationed in grams. Sugar was a rumor, and here in the middle of an ocean, the enemy handed them dessert. No speech, no explanation, no humiliation, just a scoop of kindness so absurd, so undeserved, it disoriented them more than any battlefield. Later that night, Frida wrote in her pocket journal, "We were supposed to be cargo, but they keep treating us like people." She didn't sleep, and she didn't know yet that in Texas they'd be greeted not with bayonets, but with barbecue. The train was silent, but it wasn't because of fear. It was the silence of disbelief, the kind that fills a room when reality doesn't behave the way it's supposed to. The German women boarded the Pullman car expecting benches, bars, and shackles. Instead, they stepped into polished wood panels, green velvet seats, and brass fixtures that gleamed like something from a postcard. No handcuffs, no shouting, no cages. There were windows they could open. And waiters. Real waiters, wearing white gloves, offering coffee in ceramic mugs. One even bowed slightly and asked, "Cream or sugar, ma'am?" Frida blinked. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Across from her, Lotta ran her fingers along the carved edges of the armrest like it was forbidden. She whispered, "Are we being transferred or adopted?" The soldiers escorting them didn't sit close. They stood near the doors, chatting quietly among themselves. No guns drawn, just an unspoken confidence, not arrogance, but ease. A teenage girl from Leipzig tried to refuse the food tray. "We're prisoners," she said softly. The attendant shrugged. "Not today, you're not. Today, you're just on a train." The roast beef was warm. The bread, soft. The apple pie tasted like nothing Frida had ever known. She stared at the crust, trying to remember when she last saw butter. Real butter. Out the window, Texas rolled by in long golden waves, sunsets that looked like paintings, towns that came and went like dreams. There were no checkpoints, no fences, no boots pacing aisles, just space and time to think. Helga, the oldest among them, finally broke the silence. "If this is the enemy," she said, "then maybe we've been fighting shadows." They thought the journey couldn't get more surreal, but the next place they stopped didn't even have walls. The cotton fields were brutal. Even in October, the Texas heat clung to the air like wet cloth. The women worked in pairs, baskets slung across their shoulders, fingers raw from pulling at burrs. No one complained. Not because it wasn't painful, but because this was still better than the fear-soaked rubble of Cologne or Dresden. Then Frida slipped. Her ankle twisted sideways with a sharp crack, and she collapsed into the dirt, dust clouding her face. For a moment, no one moved. In Germany, injury during wartime meant self-reliance or abandonment. But here, something different happened. Two guards rushed over, not shouting, not blaming. One knelt, checked her foot, then whistled toward the pickup truck. "We'll get her to the clinic," he said. "Just hang tight." Clinic? Frida didn't understand until she was sitting on a padded bench, air-conditioned breeze crawling over her skin, while a nurse adjusted a lead apron and rolled an X-ray machine into place. No questions about loyalty, no interrogation, no documents, only concern. "You'll need rest," the doctor said later, holding up a translucent film with her fractured bones. "And these?" He handed her 2 bottles of pills. Real penicillin, real painkillers. She stared at them like artifacts from another world. When she returned to camp, the others gathered around. She tried to speak, but all she could manage was, "They used medicine on me, as if I mattered." Helga took the bottle from her hand, read the label and whispered, "My cousin died last year from a scratch. No drugs left, not even for soldiers." No one spoke for a long time. The women sat together in the dark, listening to the cicadas scream outside. Frida held the X-ray film up to the moonlight and saw for the first time the shape of her own bones and something deeper beneath them, shifting. Because if the enemy could heal her without asking for anything in return, what else might they undo? It started with a cough. Ilse, the quiet one from Frankfurt, had been pale for days, her breath catching with every step, lips tinged blue by the Texas air. She tried to hide it, afraid of being labeled weak, afraid of being sent somewhere worse. But one morning, during roll call, she collapsed. 2 American medics rushed in, not with rifles, with a stretcher. Within minutes, she was gone, whisked away to a civilian hospital in town. No interrogation, no chains, just an ambulance. Frida expected the next time they saw her, Ilse would be gaunt, broken, humiliated. But 3 days later, she returned, clean, rested, and carrying something none of them expected. A yellow envelope. Inside, a copy of her lung X-ray and a handwritten note from the attending physician. Your pneumonia has cleared. Stay warm. Dr. Ellis. No mention of prisoner, no demand for information, just care. Ilse didn't speak that night. She simply placed the note under her pillow like a prayer. The others passed the envelope around as if it were a holy relic. Back home, even wounded soldiers were left to rot if they carried the wrong papers. Here, a foreign enemy was given treatment in a clean bed under fluorescent lights, without a single question of allegiance. Helga finally muttered, "This country, either they're insane or we've never known what humanity looks like." Frida said nothing, but that night she asked for a pen, not to write a report, not to confess, to send a letter, one she'd never send, to her mother, telling her about kindness without conditions. They thought it had reached a peak. But the next day they saw something that shattered them completely, a radar, hidden inside a cargo ship. They thought it was just a merchant ship. From the edge of the cotton fields, the German women could see it gliding upriver. Long, grey, boxy. Nothing menacing. Nothing remarkable. Just another American supply vessel, stacked high with crates and barrels under the afternoon sun. But then the truck arrived. 3 American technicians jumped out. One climbed a narrow ladder welded to the ship's bridge, holding what looked like a small satellite dish. The others unloaded a steel console, bristling with dials and scopes, whispering to each other in fast, clipped English. Helga squinted, her eyes narrowing. "That's not for communications," she said quietly. That's targeting." Frida frowned. "On a cargo ship." They watched as the crew powered the thing up. A humming began, soft at first, then rising to a low pulse like something alive. On a side panel, a green screen flickered to life. One of the sailors adjusted a knob, and a series of dots swept across the display in slow, perfect arcs. It wasn't guesswork. It was vision. Radar. Mounted not on a destroyer, not on a plane, but on a civilian-looking supply ship. Back in Germany, radar units were secret, sacred, limited. Precious machines that required whole teams to operate, hidden deep underground, guarded like crown jewels. Here, it was bolted onto a freighter like an afterthought. Ilse whispered, "How many of these do they have?" No one answered. Because the question wasn't how many, it was how much further ahead they were. That night, the air felt heavier. The wind carried no comfort, only realization. The women sat in silence, staring out into the Texas dusk. Because this wasn't just defeat on the battlefield. It was a dismantling of belief, one quiet dot at a time. But they hadn't yet seen the true madness, a pipeline that ran under the sea. It sounded like a rumor at first. One of the older guards, a soft-spoken Texan with a limp and a habit of whistling hymns, mentioned it over lunch. Just a passing comment. They ran fuel under the ocean, right across the channel, like a garden hose to the front lines. The German women froze. A pipe? Helga asked, eyebrows raised. Under the sea? He nodded. Pluto, they called it. Pipelines under the ocean, from England to Normandy. We had trucks stuck in the mud. They had gas flowing like tap water. Frida set her fork down, because that, if true, changed everything. They had grown up with the idea that war was trench and tank, bullet and ration, that strategy meant supply trains and telegrams. But this was something else. A quiet infrastructure war, invisible, relentless, inhumanly efficient. That night, the camp projector flickered to life with an American newsreel. Black and white images of engineers welding joints in secret, laying coils of pipe on the ocean floor while shells still fell in the distance. The narrator's voice was calm, even proud. Fuel lines that kept the tanks rolling, 24 hours a day, with the enemy none the wiser. None the wiser. Frida felt her stomach tighten. Not from fear, from the deep, hollow recognition that they, the so-called master race, had been blind. Pluto didn't roar, it didn't drop bombs. It didn't need to. It just flowed. Quiet, steady, unstoppable. Helga muttered, "This isn't war, it's inevitability." And for the first time, no one argued. They had not just lost the war, they had failed to understand the shape of it. And still, something worse awaited. An American factory that birthed a bomber every hour. They thought it was a mistranslation. At an orientation lecture, a strange American ritual where POWs were shown films to help understand our enemy, a young officer stood before them, clean-cut, smiling too easily, and said, "Here in America, we build one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. That's right, ladies. By the time you finish this presentation, another one's already airborne." The room fell silent. Frida glanced at Helga, who simply shook her head, lips pressed into a line. "Impossible," she whispered. "Even with forced labor, that timeline is fantasy." But then the screen lit up. Grainy film reels of the Willow Run plant in Michigan, an industrial cathedral that stretched farther than the eye could see. Endless lines of fuselages rolled forward on conveyor belts. Hundreds of women in uniforms, riveted panels, wired engines, painted insignias. The music in the background was cheerful. The numbers in the subtitles were devastating. 7,500 planes a year, 2 shifts. Round the clock, no bombs, no blackouts, just output. At one point, the camera zoomed out and showed a B-24 rolling off the line, while the next one was already being assembled 20 yards behind it. Frida couldn't breathe. Back in Germany, aircraft production meant secrecy, concrete bunkers, bomb raids, and skeleton crews. It took 3 months to produce a fighter, sometimes longer. And now, the enemy was treating bombers like bread rolls. Not crafted, stamped, mass-produced, like time didn't matter, because they owned time. The officer ended the reel with a shrug. "We don't fight to prove who's tougher. We just outbuild, outrun, and outlast." No one clapped, no one moved, because in that moment, pride died. A quiet death. And even that wasn't the worst part. The next morning, they watched Americans destroy their own fuel, just so the Germans couldn't touch it. The smoke rose for miles, thick, black and bitter, not from combat, not from accident, but from choice. The German women were being moved again. This time, past a former Allied depot on the Gulf Coast. Their trucks slowed as they passed a field of scorched earth, where vast tanks had once stored aviation fuel, Now nothing more than twisted metal and blackened ground. A private riding in the front turned and said casually, "We torched it. Couldn't risk Jerry sniffing around once we pulled back." Frida blinked. "You burned your own fuel?" He nodded. 50,000 gallons, give or take. Ilsa gasped. "That's enough to keep a division moving for weeks." The guard chuckled. "We figured it was easier than hauling it. Besides, we can make more." That last sentence landed like shrapnel. Back home, children were dying for lack of coal. Civilians boiled weeds to survive. Train routes collapsed for lack of diesel. Oil, precious, sacred, was guarded like blood. And here, Americans poured it into the dirt like it was nothing. Frida watched the flames crackle in the distance, the smoke twisting into a sky too vast to contain it. In her mind, she saw her father, in 43, shivering in the dark, lighting a single match over a crust of rye. She remembered stealing coal chips from train yards, bribing guards with potatoes, and now the enemy burned oceans of fuel just to inconvenience her country. They weren't wasteful, they were unbothered. They had more. Helga whispered, "This isn't arrogance, it's abundance." And for the first time, Frida didn't feel anger. She felt small. They thought the horror ended there. But then came a weapon that exploded, without ever touching you. They had no word for it. Not in German, not in science, not even in the cold, precise language of military engineering. Because nothing in their textbooks had prepared them for a shell that could think. It was a rainy afternoon when the subject came up. An American sergeant, bored, perhaps eager to impress, was talking to one of the guards near the fence. Loud enough for the German women to hear. "They didn't even have to hit the plane," he said, tapping his helmet. The shell knew when to explode. Frida looked up. What did he say? "Proximity fuse," Helga replied, eyes already narrowing. "They have artillery that detonates when it senses nearness. Not impact, presence." The women fell into stunned silence. During the Blitz, they had all huddled under cellars while bomb after bomb screamed downward. Some misfiring, some harmless duds, some cutting clean through buildings before finally erupting. Even on the battlefield, soldiers knew that if you ducked low or moved fast, you might survive. But this was intelligence. This was a weapon that knew. Later that week, an American newsreel confirmed it. A secret program developed in hidden labs, where physicists designed microtubes and sensors so delicate they could detect a wingtip and explode midair. No ricochet, no chance. Just precise, airborne death. Helga muttered, "This isn't war. This is math." Frida clenched the armrest of her bench. Because this was no longer about strength or strategy, it was about the terrifying realization that they were fighting ghosts, nations whose weapons didn't even need to see you to kill you. A fuse with a mind of its own, a sky that punished presence. And just when it seemed technology couldn't become more brutal, they met a weapon that guided itself. They used to believe in fog, in cloud cover, in snowstorms, in nightfall, in the little gifts nature gave soldiers to survive another hour. But in Bastogne, even the weather betrayed them. The American sergeant who told the story was missing 2 fingers and carried a limp that made him look older than he was. He didn't brag. He just talked. Quiet. Steady, like someone describing a ghost that still visited him in sleep. He said it started on the 3rd day of fog. The German lines had advanced, tanks dug in. American forces were boxed in, low on supplies, praying for air support that couldn't see through the clouds. And then the bombs fell. Perfectly. Straight through the fog. No flares, no spotters, just steel rain. Clean. Precise. Brutal. Because the planes didn't need to see. They had radar. Frida and the others listened from the shade of the barracks porch. No one interrupted. No one dared to. "Whole batteries taken out," the sergeant said, rubbing his palm as if the memory laved under the skin. They thought they were safe. They thought fog would save them. But we had MIT boys back home who built eyes that could see through clouds. Radar-guided bombing, signal-reflective navigation, the sky, once a place of chance and mercy, had become a machine. Helga whispered, "So even the dark is theirs?" Frida looked at the horizon. There had been a time when she believed German cunning could outwit American might. That one panzer crew with enough willpower and strategy could tip the scales. But now it wasn't about bravery or cleverness. It was about a future that had already arrived, just not in Europe. And still, the deepest wound hadn't yet been felt, because the most unbearable blow wasn't what the enemy did. It was what they refused to do. There was no fence, no barbed wire, no watchtowers, no men with rifles pacing under floodlights. Just a crooked wooden sign, hand-painted in chipped red letters. POW zone, do not enter without clearance. Frida thought it was a mistake at first, a temporary setup, some oversight in construction. But after 3 days of waking to birdsong and the distant sound of the tractors, she realized the truth. They were being trusted by their captors, by their enemies, and that truth was more disorienting than any cage. One morning, Ilse wandered toward the edge of the grounds. There was no gate, just a dirt road that vanished into the trees. She stood there for a long time, arms folded, staring at the line she wasn't supposed to cross, but could. Behind her, a guard leaned casually against a fence post, sipping coffee from a tin mug. No orders, no threats. Just a gentle, almost amused nod. "Go on," he said. "See where it gets you." Ilse didn't move, because the question wasn't whether she could leave, but whether she wanted to. They were fed, sheltered, spoken to like people, given books, sometimes music. One girl even received a sewing kit, as if the Americans believed boredom was more dangerous than escape. Frida watched it happen in the slow motion. The collapse of fear, not through violence, but through dignity. At night, the women lay in bunks and stared at ceilings. No one talked of escape, no one whispered plans, because no one felt imprisoned. And that, somehow, was harder to bear. Back in Germany, the very soil was barbed. Fear had a face and a name. Here, it had melted in the heat, slipped into the silence, and vanished. And then it happened. One girl left and returned, voluntarily, with a bag of oranges, given by a farmer's wife. Frida turned away, but not before seeing the tears. Because they were beginning to understand. They weren't losing their freedom. They were losing the certainty that they had ever truly possessed it. The invitation came on a Sunday, scrawled in looping cursive on the back of a grocery list, passed quietly from a local farmer to the camp guard, who, after a moment of hesitation, read it aloud in the mess hall. "We'd be honored to have a few of the ladies join us for supper this evening. Nothing fancy, just roast, pie, and company. Signed, the Caldwells." Frida thought it was a joke, a trap, or some American stunt meant to humiliate. But then she saw the look on the guard's face. Not mocking, not commanding, just sincere. 4 women were chosen. She was one of them. They were driven out, past the fields, to a white farmhouse with a sagging porch and a single lantern burning by the steps. Inside, it smelled like cinnamon and onions. Photographs lined the walls, sons in uniform. A wedding portrait, yellowed with time. A child's crayon drawing of a horse. Mrs. Caldwell met them at the door, apron dusted, with flour, hair pinned in a bun. She didn't flinch. She didn't look through them. She smiled. "Hope y'all are hungry." And that's when Frida felt it. That unbearable ache just beneath the ribs. The kind that comes not from hunger, but from being seen after too long in the dark. Dinner was roast beef, corn pudding, green beans, and pecan pie. No one spoke at first, but then Mr. Caldwell, tall, soft-spoken, brought out his guitar. He strummed a few chords and sang low and warm. Home, home, on the range. Frida didn't know the words, but the melody pierced her like a memory from before the war, before uniforms, before hate. Ilsa cried openly. Mrs. Caldwell gently reached across the table, handed her a napkin, and said, "Honey, war don't make you less human. Don't let it take that from you." No sermon, no politics, just supper and grace. That night, as the truck drove them back under a harvest moon, Frida whispered, "They fed me, not because I surrendered, but because I exist." And still, something deeper was yet to break. The letter she would never send waited under her pillow. It began with a stolen moment. Late at night, after lights out, Frida sat on her bunk with a borrowed pen and a crumpled scrap of ration paper. The other women were asleep, or pretending to be, breathing soft against the Texas wind that slipped through the open window. She didn't know why she wrote, only that she had to. "Liebe Mama, I don't know what to tell you anymore." Her hand trembled, not from fear, from shame, from something deeper, a splintered guilt that no ideology had prepared her for. "You said to be brave, that they would break me with cruelty and chains. But Mama, they haven't. They've undone me with pie." She paused, ink pooling on the page. "The guard who gave me medicine asked about my favorite music. The cook who serves our meals hums lullabies. Yesterday, a little girl waved to me from a fence, holding a sunflower twice her size. I wanted to wave back, but my hand wouldn't move." Frida wiped a tear before it stained the paper. "I don't hate them, Mama. I hate how kind they are. I hate that it's working. I don't know what this war was ever truly about. But if it was supposed to kill our spirits, then maybe we're the only ones who followed through." She stared at the page for a long time, then folded it, gently, and tucked it beneath her pillow. She would never send it. Because her mother wouldn't understand. Because the girl who started the letter no longer fully existed. The camp bell rang in the distance, and outside, the Texas stars flickered like they knew something she didn't. But the final break was still coming, and it would arrive not with cruelty, but with silence. It was just after noon when the kitchen doors swung open and the leftovers were hauled out. 2 large tin bins, dented and steaming, carried by a pair of teenage orderlies in army aprons. They laughed as they walked, arguing about baseball, not even noticing the German women watching from the edge of the compound. Inside those bins was food, real food, thick slices of roast, cornbread soaked in gravy, potatoes still warm, apple skins curled like ribbons, and meat, so much meat, scraped from untouched plates and dumped into the trash like it meant nothing. Frida froze mid-step. Ilsa stopped breathing. Helga reached for the fence rail to steady herself. In Germany, they had buried neighbors over moldy bread. Children had chewed leather belts. Soup had been made from wallpaper glue. Soldiers shared one tin of sardines across 3 days and still counted themselves lucky. And here, the enemy threw meat away, not because they were cruel, but because they could. Frida didn't speak. She didn't scream. There was no fury left, only the sharp, cold stillness of realizing she had been lied to, not just about victory or strength or duty, but about what it meant to be civilized. She turned, slowly, and walked back to the barracks. Inside, the others sat in silence, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. No one dared mention it, but they all saw the food, the waste, the laughter. That night, Frida couldn't pray. She couldn't sleep. She stared up at the ceiling and whispered to herself, as if to someone long dead, "If they are the barbarians, what does that make us?" Not one of them touched their dinner. And in that empty act of refusal, they surrendered something far deeper than loyalty. But the lights outside never dimmed. And in the next days, neither did the questions. It was past midnight when Frida noticed it, a soft golden haze glowing against the windows, not the moon, not a lantern, something steadier, unbothered. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake the others, and crept to the edge of the barracks. The door was unlocked. It always was. Outside, the camp was quiet, too quiet for wartime. But the light, it came from everywhere. The watchtower wasn't manned, but its bulbs still burned. The mess hall kitchen glowed from within, an electric hum pulsing behind frosted glass. Even the utility shed, nothing more than a shack of tin and timber, had a light over the door, buzzing lazily, attracting moths. She stepped into the yard, barefoot on the warm wood planks, and turned toward the horizon. There, beyond the camp, past the trees and fields, was the distant shimmer of a town that had never learned to be afraid of the dark. Back in Germany, darkness was safety. A city without light was a city with a chance. Her brother had died because someone lit a cigarette too close to a window. Her aunt was buried beneath rubble from a British bombing run that followed the faint glow of a bakery's oven. Light meant death. But here, light meant normal, not defiance, not arrogance, just a quiet assumption that nothing bad was coming. Because for them, it never had. And in that moment, standing under a sky full of steady stars and stubborn light bulbs, Frida realized something terrifying. They didn't hide from the night because they didn't need to. They had never been broken. Not from above, not from within. A tear slipped down her cheek, uninvited. "We built bunkers," she whispered. "They built baseball fields." And suddenly, she wasn't angry anymore. She was lost. But the war inside her wasn't over yet, because the next morning, someone gave her a book, a story in English, meant for children, and it cracked open a door no bomb ever could. The book wasn't assigned, it wasn't part of any re-education program, or handed out with leaflets like some wartime trick. It just appeared, left quietly on Frida's bunk one morning, between her blanket and the chipped tin cup she used for tea. The cover was soft and worn, the pages slightly yellowed. Charlotte's Web. She didn't recognize the title, but the illustration caught her. A small pig, a spider, and a web that shimmered faintly under the morning sun. Tucked inside was a note, scribbled in neat handwriting. "You might like this one. It's about friendship and freedom." CPL'll read. Frida didn't open it at first. She stared at the cover for a long time, fingers brushing the edges like it might vanish. The others didn't ask. No one teased. That night, under the dim light bulb above her cot, she began. The words came slowly. She didn't understand every sentence, but she sounded them out anyway, mouthing them in silence. Humble, radiant, terrific. She whispered them like spells, words she had never said before, words that had no place in war. By the end of the first chapter, she wasn't reading a book. She was crossing a border. Something shifted inside her, not as a soldier or a German or even a prisoner, but as a girl who, for the first time in years, felt curious and maybe even safe. The next morning, she asked the camp librarian, a shy volunteer from the nearby town, if she had more books for children who speak a different first. The woman smiled, handed her The Little Prince. Frida took it with both hands as if it might break. Later, she found Ilse tracing words with her finger along the spine of To Kill a Mockingbird. No one said a word. They just passed the books like water. That afternoon, Frida wrote a single line in her journal. I think I'm becoming fluent in something larger than language. But one question still haunted her. What if none of this had ever happened? There was no ceremony, no line in the sand, no trumpet that marked the moment when Frida surrendered. Not her country, her certainty. It happened quietly, in a place she never thought to guard, somewhere between the last page of Charlotte's Web and the soft laughter of a boy in overalls who waved to her from the back of a pickup truck. That day, the camp hosted a small fair, a strange blend of Baptist potluck and wartime fundraiser. Civilians were allowed to visit. Some brought pies, others music. A group of children from Amarillo arrived with homemade kites, trailing red, white, and blue tails across the Texas sky. The German women stood at the edge, unsure if they were guests or ghosts. Then a little girl tugged Frida's sleeve. Want to fly one? Frida hesitated. She looked around for disapproval. From the guards, from her peers, from the voice in her own head that still wore a swastika. But no one stopped her. She knelt, took the string, let the wind pull it. The kite soared. And with it, something inside her lifted, a weight she hadn't known she was carrying. Years of indoctrination, of pride wrapped in fear, of believing that honor could only be preserved in clenched fists and closed borders. She laughed, not loud, not for show, but free. That night, as they returned to their barracks, Ilse said softly, I thought they would try to beat belief out of us. Frida nodded, but they didn't. Ilse looked over. Then how did they do it? Frida whispered. They smiled. They fed us. They taught us lullabies. And they never once asked us to stop being human. There was no guard at the gate that night, only moonlight, and the quiet realization that the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal was dignity. But there was still one memory Frida kept locked away, a moment so human, so painful, she never spoke of it again. The old woman moved slowly now. Her hair, once jet black, beneath a soldier's cap, had faded into strands of silver that caught the afternoon light like threads of wind. But her back was still straight, her eyes still sharp. She stood at the edge of the Texas ranch, hands resting gently on the saddle horn of a horse she had not seen in 60 years. It wasn't the same animal, of course, but it looked like him. Chestnut brown with a white stripe down its nose, like the one she had ridden on her first day as a prisoner. Only she hadn't felt like a prisoner that day. Not really. Not anymore. A small crowd had gathered behind her. Townspeople, descendants of guards and farmers, and a few students who didn't quite understand why this frail German woman was being honored in their sleepy Texas town. The mayor spoke briefly. A handful of reporters took notes. Then came the flag. An American veteran stepped forward and placed it in her hands. Folded tight, crisp, reverent. She looked down at it, then up at the sky, and finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear, thick with accent, but steady. They didn't change what I believed. They changed what I was allowed to believe. Then she did something unexpected. She mounted the horse, slowly, carefully. And for a moment, the years fell away. Frida, the girl who had once stepped off a train expecting chains, now rode through the pasture like she belonged to it. The wind caught the edge of the flag she held to her chest, and the crowd didn't clap. They didn't cheer. They simply watched, in silence, as history came full circle. Somewhere, a child asked, "Grandma, why is she crying?" And someone answered, "Because sometimes kindness is heavier than war." If this changed how you see history, share it with someone who still remembers, or someone who never knew. And ask yourself, if your grandfather had fallen in love with the enemy, would he have told you? We'll see you next time when we uncover the truth about the prisoner who smuggled lullabies across barbed wire. Not to escape, but to stay human.